Hello, welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. As you are aware, we are in a series of video lectures or video virtual classes in the domain of cultural studies, and these lectures are targeted, or the target audience is are the engineering students in various IITs and engineering institutions in India. Many of you are aware that the humanities and social sciences float elective courses in various areas, in various disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, and cultural studies is one such course and one that I teach at IIT Guwahati. We have already been through a couple of lectures, and by now you are aware of the the basic propositions and the scope of cultural studies. We also began by saying that it is not wise, as many critics have pointed out, to leave out the what science has to tell us about culture, and hence we are also devoting a couple of lectures to to an exploration of what science can tell us about culture, and how also cultural studies may benefit from the sciences. So, as always, let us do a recap of the last lecture, and you will recall that in the last lecture we found that incorporating studies of the mind, looking at the human mind and particularly the way it has evolved, is one of the basic requirements in cultural studies. Why? Because it is the mind, isn't it, that gives us culture, that gives us various thoughts, various feelings, various theories, and leads us to organize our socio-cultural lives in particular ways, right. So, if you look at the slide here, the mind within this is seen as a set of information processing machines. You will see that there is a definite shift here from traditional ways of understanding the mind. For instance, in different religions, the mind is understood certainly not as a set of information processing machines, but if we look at what study of science and biology and evolutionary theory, Darwinian theory have to they have to tell us about the mind, our mind that forms or creates culture, then we have to go to a discourse that tells us that the mind is indeed a set of information processing machines. The mind is also, second, as we saw, designed by natural selection in order to solve adaptive problems which were faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And we saw that in the last lecture that it is important to realize that our minds are actually not sort of, I would not say suited, but it is not designed to solve our current problems as much as it is designed to solve certain evolutionary or adaptive problems. The goal therefore of evolutionary psychology, we saw, was to discover and understand the design and structure of the human mind. So, there are 2 points that we saw: the design and the structure of the human mind. This is what evolutionary psychology looks at. Therefore, we called evolutionary psychology after the scholars Tooby and Cosmides an approach to psychology, not really a branch of psychology, an approach to psychology where knowledge and principles from evolutionary biology are sort of gleaned or borrowed for research on the structure of the human mind. So, evolutionary biology, we saw, was the main sort of domain from which evolutionary psychology draws its inspiration in order to tell us or order to give us information and knowledge about how the human mind originated, about how the human mind developed over evolutionary time. So, well, let us go to the key source texts in our lecture here, and the key source texts in our lecture today are Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice, and Lida Cosmides and John Tooby's Evolutionary Psychology, a primer. Now, we have already been through some of the formulations given in this domain, and we will in this lecture quickly move on to the principles of evolutionary psychology. Well, we could even say that the lectures that today's lecture is devoted mainly to the 5 principles of evolutionary psychology. So, these principles, as you know, have been given to us by the evolutionary scholars Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, and today we will really focus on the principles as have been given to us by Tooby and Cosmides. It is not that there aren't other principles, but we should, I think, choose one text, okay, so that there are no overlaps when we kind of glean the principles from several texts. So, we are going to look at the principles of evolutionary psychology, the foundational principles, so to speak, that have been given to us by Cosmides and Tooby. First, principle number 1, it says that the brain is a physical system. It functions as a computer. Okay, look at the analogy with the computer. Remember, just a while ago we had said that under the domain of evolutionary psychology, we find that the mind is seen as a set of information processing machines, right, or sets of information processing machines. In the same way as the computer is a computer processes information, right. So, the brain within this domain is seen as a physical system. It functions as a computer. Its circuits are designed to generate behavior that is appropriate to your environmental circumstances. Now, we need to look very carefully. Indeed, this principle is very carefully worded, okay, or written out or worded by the scholars. Okay. A is what? The brain is a physical system. It is it functions like a computer, okay, it processes information, and the circuits here, the circuits of the brain are for a purpose. Okay. What is the purpose of the circuits of the brain? The purpose is this, that it has to generate behavior, okay, in beings, right, in organisms. It has to generate behavior towards a certain goal or purpose. And what is it? That behavior which is generated by these sets of information processing machines called the circuits in the brain should be appropriate, okay, should be appropriate to our environmental circumstances. This also is an extremely important word, and we shall see in a while what appropriate means. Okay. So, what is the first principle? The first principle says that the brain is a computer and its circuits are information processing machines, and there is a certain purpose in these, as information is received and decisions are taken. It is this, that it has to generate behavior, the circuits have to generate behavior in organisms, okay, not any random kind of behavior that is appropriate, okay, to the environmental circumstances in which the organism lives. So, from this it also follows therefore that appropriate behavior, okay, appropriateness, or what is appropriate behavior will definitely, even if you look around and look at different organism species, you will understand that or it is not difficult really to understand that appropriate behavior is different from organism to organism, okay, from species to species. What is inappropriate for a species may be very appropriate for another. Therefore, if we look at this as a diagram, the brain is a physical system, okay, which functions like a computer in order to generate appropriate behavior, and the brain is governed by the laws of physics and chemistry. This may sound a bit reductionist, as sort of we may think, well, all the rich content that we have in our minds, the beautiful art products that we do when we fall in love, for instance, does it mean that these are only governed, these are all to do with chemical signals? Indeed, at this level it is so, but it does not at all do away with the fact that our minds generate very rich content. Okay. So, in this case we have to understand and we have to accept the fact that our brains and what happens inside our brains, okay, this is governed by the laws of physics and chemistry. Therefore, what is appropriate behavior? Right, I said I would come to this point. What is appropriate behavior? And we found initially that appropriate behavior is behavior that is appropriate to one's environmental circumstances. Now, let us read from Tooby and Cosmides' text. This is what they have to say. A. Different organisms may have different appropriate behavior for the same environment. This is immensely important as you understand, begin to understand culture, okay, in the broadest sense of the term culture, which also includes the way of living of different organisms, of different animals, for instance, and to see how the way of living is different, okay, how you know, they are different from one another. So, different organisms have different appropriate behavior for the same environment. This is important. The environment may be the same. Second, while the appropriate behavior for a machine is decided by an engineer, we know who has, you know, who makes a machine. The engineer makes the machine with a certain purpose in mind, okay, thinking that it's going to serve a certain purpose. So, while for a machine, for or silicon based machine, the appropriate behavior is already decided by an engineer, we may ask the question, in that case, who engineers our appropriate behavior? Okay. So, this is an important question, to which the answer given by Tooby and Cosmides is this: the appropriate behavior for a particular situation is decided for organisms by a process called natural selection. So, if the engineer is the one who decides the appropriate behavior or who drives the appropriate behavior for a machine, for us, okay, the appropriate behavior is decided by, or we at least we have to respond to or adapt to what? The principle of natural selection, which you remember was given to us by one of the greatest scientists, that is Charles Darwin, right. So, our brain, if you look at the slide here, the brain interestingly can also be called a wet computer. Okay. Now, again this is carrying on the analogy between the brain and the computer. The brain is a wet computer. Okay. It is not a silicon based computer, it is a carbon based computer, right, whose job is the processing of information, and it is an organic carbon based computer, or which we call a wet computer. But the function is analogous to the of the brain is analogous to the function of the computer. And what was it? You will recall from a couple of slides ago. If I ask you what is the function of the brain? The function of the brain, that is the function of the various circuits of the brain, is to process information, right. To process information, the brain is a set of information processing mechanisms, and this is towards a particular goal, and the goal is to do what? To generate appropriate behavior under environmental circumstances. The brain, I am sure many of you are aware of this, but just to recapitulate, the brain therefore comprises, among other things, neurons and neuroglia or supporting structures, which are also known as neural glue, for instance, neurons and supporting structures, whose job is to transmit information. The circuitry of the brain, according to Tooby and Cosmides, is to generate motion. Okay. And remember, this word behavior, no matter how we understand the word behavior, okay, in our common parlance, in our everyday parlance, means something very particular in in evolutionary psychology. Behavior here is defined as motion. This is very important. Okay. So, just a while ago we said that the brain has neurons and supporting structures whose job is to transmit information, right. So, we find here the transmitting of information eventually has to lead to motion, and which is known as behavior, and this is again related to information that is received from the environment. Okay. So, we are talking a bit about the brain here, because obviously we in this domain we believe that the mind emanates from the brain, and hence in the beginning it is important for us to see how the brain operates. Okay. Now, we come to the second principle as given to us, as has been given to us by Tooby and Cosmides. Now, principle 2 as described by Tooby and Cosmides goes like this, and these are their words. Our neural circuits were designed by natural selection to solve problems. This is A. Our neural circuits were designed by natural selection to solve problems. What kind of problems? Problems that our ancestors faced during our species evolutionary history. It is very important for us to remind ourselves again that evolutionary psychology is also, the methodology is what we call reverse engineering, and those of you who are from engineering would know this very well. Okay. So, you sort of you dismantle a product or a machine and go back in order to see how it was created, right. So, if we have to understand, the whole point of doing this in this course is this: if we have to understand how our minds work, then we would have to understand why it was there in the first place, right, and how it evolved, which means asking questions like, what were the problems, okay, in our species evolutionary history for which the circuits were developed. Okay. So, you see how principle 2 follows beautifully from principle 1. Okay. Our circuits were developed to generate behavior, okay, with the purpose of adapting to the pressures of natural selection. Okay. And here we find that those problems, our neural circuits were designed by natural selection to solve not current problems, but to solve those problems which our ancestors had faced in our evolutionary history. Okay. More about this, and you will find that other principles will also throw light on these first two principles. Now, a quick look again at Darwin's The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, and I am quoting from The Origin of Species because this will make clear the principle of natural selection. Very beautifully put by Darwin, certainly long sentences as going by 19th century writing, but let us look at the two pillars, so to speak, of Darwinian evolutionary theory, that species adapt, okay, species adapt to changes in their environment, okay, and this, had there not been two drives called survival and reproduction, perhaps species would not have adapted. Okay. So, species therefore A need to survive and B they need to reproduce. So, let us read, this is straight from Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin said, owing to this struggle for life, okay, this is very important. Owing to the struggle for life, any variation, that is any change, any variation, however slight and from whatever cause proceeding, if it be in any degree profitable to an individual of any species, in its infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to external nature, will tend to the preservation of that individual and will generally be inherited by its offspring. I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection. Okay. So, what Darwin is saying here very clearly is that there is a struggle, okay, there is a struggle for life, and in our struggle for life there are certain changes which help us to adapt. Okay. Any variation, he says, remember, any variation, if useful, is preserved in the individual. Not only that, it is also, that variation is also passed on to succeeding generations, right. So much so that ultimately those generations, those members or those generations which have been able to retain that useful variation, you will find more people, more members or more people in that population than those who did not have that useful variation. Those are going to be extinct, or those are going to die out, or for instance, those are not going to succeed in the struggle for life or struggle for existence. And then he says that will be inherited by its offspring, and I have called, he says, I have called this principle by which each of these changes, useful changes, okay, is preserved. I have named this principle that of natural selection. This is you may say, as you as scientists, as technologists will recognize that this is perhaps one of, if not the most, or at least one of the most important theoretical formulations and findings that could have been given by any scientist ever, really. Okay. So, the main points here in Darwinian theory, which has the points which have a lot of consequences even for culture, are these: there are variation, okay, inheritance, high rate of population and growth where there is a struggle for survival or struggle for life, and importantly differential survival and reproduction. Okay. It is not exactly survival per se that we are talking about. Okay. We are talking about differential survival. What might differential survival mean? There has to be a difference, okay, among among a group that is that is in the struggle for life or struggle for survival and reproduction. Okay. And whoever gains in that, whoever has that differentiating, so to speak, element or variation in them, okay, will survive. Hence, the survival or the reproduction is known not as reproduction and survival per se. Remember, this is extremely important, or it is also known as a, and more importantly, we should call it a differential survival and reproduction. Therefore, we have to understand also, as Subi and Cosmides have brought to our notice, that natural selection, it does not mean that it works always for the benefit of the species in the way, in the commonsensical way that we may think it to be. Okay. It is just a process in which a trait or a characteristic causes its own spread through a population, sometimes even leading to the extinction of the species. Okay. So, we should not think that natural selection is a sort of a process that always be useful for the benefit of the species. If the species does not adapt or does not produce appropriate behavior, okay, for the circumstances, for the changes or the selection pressures, then the species will not survive. Therefore, the problems which we have faced during our species evolutionary history has to do with a certain pressure. Okay. So, we used this term a while ago. The pressure is natural selection, is a selection pressure on our neural circuits to do what? To produce appropriate behavior. So, then we also talked about problems, and we are going to ask what kind of problems and are we talking about. Remember, natural selection gives there is a selection pressure. Species will have to solve these problems, the neural circuitry will have to process information and generate behavior which are towards which are geared towards solving of the problems, right. So, what kind of problems are we really talking about? So, these are spelled out by the authors. Okay. These problems are called adaptive information processing problems. We will term these adaptive information processing problems, and these are among the most important ones are these 4. A, face recognition, B, threat interpretation, C, language, and D, navigation. If you look at all of these are not simply things to do with biology. Okay? This is to do definitely with survival, but face recognition in a of by members in a certain population, for instance, which face is a threatening face, which face is a friendly face, for instance. Threat interpretation also, where, to be able to interpret, if you cannot interpret a threat and produce behavior that is appropriate towards a threat, then you cannot survive, right. So, face recognition, threat interpretation, eventually language also, right, language and navigation, to be able to navigate in a certain territory or locale. These are what have been termed as the basic adaptive problems by Tooby and Kusmaitis. So, behavior therefore, as we saw, is a directed, we will call it a directed after Tooby and Kusmaitis, we shall call it a directed response of an organism to one's environment, and which is the response is both chemical and physical. So, behavior again can be divided into innate behavior and learned behavior. Innate behavior is behavior that is developmentally fixed, whereas learned behavior is behavior that is modified by experience. So, this learned behavior is a behavior as information processing machines that are geared towards survival and reproduction, that has to be modified by experience in a changing world, okay, or in a changing scenario. And these decisions, this learning and changing is a job that is performed by our neural circuitry. Well, now we come to principle number 3, the third principle of evolutionary psychology, as was given or has been given to us by Lida Kusmaitis and John Tooby. Let us read from here. In their words, the third principle goes like this. It has to do with our consciousness. Consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of what goes on in your mind is hidden from you. This is very important. Okay? Most of what goes on in our mind is something that we do not experience, or we do not know, or do not have access to. Then, as a result, your conscious experience can mislead you into thinking that our circuitry is simpler than it really is. Sorry, than, it should be than it really is. Most problems that you experience as easy to solve are very difficult to solve. They require very complicated neural circuitry. Now, what is consciousness? Now, obviously, consciousness is defined in different ways, okay, by people from different domains. For instance, in religion, consciousness may be defined in many ways. It may be called chitta, for instance, in Hindu, in the Hindu religion, or it may have so many different different ways of description. Many may even say that consciousness is something that is given to us by some supernatural power, for instance. Okay? But we have to remember that we are speaking in the discourse, within the discourse and within the limits of science, right? And how do we look at consciousness here? Okay? The authors say that consciousness here is that is our conscious awareness. Okay? I am aware that I am here, I am speaking to you, that this lecture is being recorded, that this is a virtual class going on, and that you are listening to me. Okay? I am aware of this, right? But this awareness, both yours and mine, is just, as they say, the tip of the iceberg. There are many processes that are going on in our brains, even as I am speaking, or I am aware of my surroundings, and you are aware of watching this video lecture. Okay? There are several sets of information processing that that are at work at this very moment as I speak and you listen to me. Okay. Our consciousness or awareness of what is going on is just just a fraction of what actually is going on in our brains. Okay. So, as they say, as a result, your conscious experience may even mislead us into thinking that our neural circuitry is extremely simple, right. Perhaps one of the difficulties in modeling the human mind and its workings through computers or maybe artificial intelligence systems is also this, is that the enormous what we may call the enormously complex ways in which the brain works, right, and which gives rise to the mind, is something which is not perhaps which has not been decoded, at least in its entirety, okay, by technology, right. Otherwise, we would have been able to make machines as complex as us. So, as a result, our conscious mind may mislead us into thinking that our circuitry is really simple than it really is, and most problems that we experience as easy to solve are really very difficult to solve, and as they say, they require very complicated neural machinery, right. So, this is principle 3 of evolutionary psychology, and consciousness therefore, as we saw, we are looking at it as awareness, okay, as in the first place as an awareness of what is going on. Okay. It is also our subjective experience, right, the experience that we undertake or undergo as perceiving subjects, as knowing subjects, as remembering subjects, as subjects paying attention to something. Okay. And finally, it also means the wakefulness of the mind. So, we have to understand that in each of these different ways of looking at consciousness, okay, the underlying circuitry of the brain and its processes, right, there is by no means simple at all for things that we experience in these domains. Okay, these require very complicated neural machinery. Okay. So, let us again look at what Leda Cosmides and John Tooby have to say. The only things you become aware of are a few high level conclusions passed on by thousands and thousands of specialized mechanisms. They say that the mechanisms, okay, that finally bring things to our awareness working sort of below the surface, if I may use the metaphor, okay, mechanisms run up to thousands of mechanisms. Okay. We are only aware of a few high level conclusions. Like if I am aware that I am here in a recording studio recording this lecture, this is a high level conclusion that I am aware of, but behind this, right, what is happening inside my brain is something that I cannot be aware of. One of the reasons perhaps is that our conscious awareness cannot handle so much of information overload, and we are not required really to know the processes. This, interestingly, you will understand, is also a survival strategy, right. If our minds are overloaded, if there is over information, then there are things that we will miss, right, in this overloading of information, which may ultimately compromise our ability to survive. So, reading on again, some that are gathering sensory information from the world, others that are analyzing and evaluating that information, checking for inconsistencies, filling in the blanks, figuring out what it all means. Okay, there is another example which I am not bringing here, which is given in Tooby and Cosmides' text. They say that when when a person looks at and recognizes his or her mother, right, he or she is aware of just that high level conclusion that this is my mother, right. But they say that in reality, okay, what is actually going on in our brains is that the visual system gives us an input, okay, as what our mother looks like. Okay. Then there are we remember the fact, our relationship with that person. Okay. So, there are thousands of mechanisms, or there are several mechanisms that are at work even in the simple, even everyday act of our recognizing somebody as our mother. And in very unfortunate cases where where people have perhaps met with an accident or there is a lesion in the brain, what happens is at times when one can't recognize one's own mother, for instance, it is a case where these underlying thousands of mechanisms that produce the result have been compromised in some way. Okay. In fact, one of the ways initially that that scientists could gather or make speculations, successful speculations about how the brain works was by looking at patients who have had their brain functions unfortunately compromised. Okay. So, we are now going to principle number 4, and this is very interesting. Principle number 4, according to Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, runs like this, that different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems, right. Look at the importance of this, which means that our brain is not an all purpose machine, okay. And as they say also in their text, really as engineers you will know very well that an all purpose machine is no good, okay. As they say, a hammer is meant to perform the job of a hammer. A hammer cannot function as a saw, right. So, a system will be successful when it is not an all purpose machine. The system will be successful when different components are serving different needs or different goals, fulfilling different goals. So, different neural circuits are specialized, let us look at this, different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems, right. And again remember, we said that evolutionary biology is very important, or it is the inspiration, or it is sort of even the template from which evolutionary psychology draws its conclusion or has a certain methodology. Okay. So, if you look at the human body, for instance, okay, what does the brain, what does the liver do for, right? The liver does not, for instance, the liver is meant for detoxifying poisons. The liver does not pump blood in us. Okay. Lungs are for respiration, kidneys for waste treatment, the heart for pumping blood, and liver for detoxification purposes, right. So, as the body, right, as our body as a different as our body has different you may say circuits which are the organs, right, like the lungs, kidneys, heart and liver to perform specialized jobs, right. So, also it is held that our brains or our mind, right, our brains have circuits which are specialized, okay, to perform certain jobs. So, again reading from Tooby and Cosmides, for the same reason our minds consist of a large number of circuits that are functionally specialized. For example, we have some neural circuits whose design is specialized for vision. All they do is help you see. In the same way, we have circuits that are designed for motor purposes, circuits that are designed for hearing, for sense, for smell, etc. Okay. So, the circuits that are doing the job of smell, of enabling us to smell, are not performing some other job of of some other sensory input. So, the design of other neural circuits is specialized for hearing. All they do is detect changes in air pressure and extract information from it. They do not participate in vision, vomiting, vanity, vengeance or anything else. Okay. So, this is just very beautifully rhetorically putting it, right. So, that just to say that those circuits which are engaged in particular jobs are not we may safely make a general statement, are not at least to in important ways concerned with or doing or helping in the job of other kind of conclusions, other circuits that give us other conclusions. They are not specialized, okay. They are that is, they are not spread out over different specializing domains. So, finally, principle number 5 also put very beautifully, our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. Look at this very carefully. Our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind, right? Modern and Stone Age. It simply means this, that our minds, okay, listen to this carefully, our minds are suited, right? Our minds, it is not that we do not do sophisticated things, but it is important for us to understand this. Our minds are not suited for our current for the current things or the current lives that we lead. Okay, our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. Okay, so the mind that we have may perform very sophisticated tasks, but actually the mind is geared to solving the old adaptive problems that we or our ancestors had faced in our evolutionary history. This is an immensely important point. Now, Tooby and Cosmides, they go on to say that in the last 10 million years, or 99 in the 99%, this is very important, 99% of our species evolutionary history, okay, was spent in hunter gatherer societies, right. So, the mind that we possess, that we have today, is the mind of the hunter gatherer society, and this is 1,000 times longer than as anything else. Okay. So, if we have spent 99% of our species evolutionary history, then obviously this modern life that we have, agriculture, okay, then our the coming in of technology, right, and our sophisticated and very complex social systems, our cultural systems, it means that this is what Tooby and Cosmides have called just an just a blink of an eye. Okay, they say the computer age, for instance, is nothing, it's just it's just a blink of an eye compared to this 99% of our species evolutionary history, which was spent by us as members of hunter gatherer societies. So, this is how they put it. The world that seems so familiar to you and me, a world with roads, schools, grocery stores, factories, farms and nation states, has lasted for only an eye blink of time when compared to our entire evolutionary history. Okay, so, that we have to understand, and that is why they say that our minds are actually those that have solved the adaptive problems that were faced by our ancestors in the past. In fact, this is very important. Okay, let me reiterate, our minds, okay, are designed, or we have minds that are actually designed to solve adaptive problems which had been faced by our hunter gatherer ancestors. Therefore, look at this, the human brain was sculpted for what they call Stone Age priorities. Okay. The Stone Age priorities would be finding mates, raising children and gathering food. You will remember when we look at the pillars of the Darwinian paradigm. Okay. Finding mates, raising children and gathering food, these are related to the twin pillars of survival and reproduction, okay, of changing, of adapting to changing circumstances, environmental circumstances and pressures, okay, and retaining, remember Darwin's words, retaining the useful variations, okay, not only that, passing it on to progeny, right. So, this therefore would include A for survival, the gathering of food, the finding of mates and the raising of children. Okay. This is what binds us to our evolutionary past, okay. And our minds, no matter, according to this school of thought, no matter no matter what complex mathematics you do, okay, no matter what complex literary forms and books that you write, right, ultimately we have to understand that our minds are geared for survival and reproduction, and that is why our priorities, as they call it, our Stone Age priorities, are for what our brains have been. So, there is a word metaphor of sculpting, because very slow process, like wind, a sculpture that has been wind blown or made by the wind. There is several thousands of years of sculpting. So, something that has taken so long, 99% of our evolutionary history, right, is here definitely to stay, and we are defined. That is why we need to look at evolutionary psychology, the mind that produces, right, the mind that produces culture, the mind that produces different cultural forms, practices, the mind that eventually made symbolic thought possible, that mind that created signs and signifying practices, is ultimately a mind that still has as its goal survival and reproduction. So, we will now come to the discussion, and quickly we will run through a few questions. What kind of machines are our minds according to evolutionary psychology? And the answer is, according to evolutionary psychology, our minds are sets of information processing machines, and there is an analogy to the computer, so much so that our brain is known as a wet computer. Next, what is the goal of evolutionary psychology? The goal of evolutionary psychology, as we saw even in the last lecture, is to discover and understand the design and structure of the human mind. Finally, what according to Tooby and Cosmides are the principles of evolutionary EP or evolutionary psychology? We will go through, we have already discussed the principles in detail. We will quickly run through it. The first principle is that the brain is a physical system, and that it is like a computer, it is a wet computer, and its job is, or that the job of the circuits is to produce behavior or to generate behavior that is environmental to, that is appropriate to our environment, I am very sorry, appropriate to your environmental circumstances. Okay. So, principle number 2 is our neural circuits were designed by natural selection. That is, the engineer here is, or the drive motivating factor is natural selection, and to solve problems. And what kind of problems? Problems that our ancestors faced during our species evolutionary history, and certainly not current problems. Principle number 3, consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of what goes on in your mind should be hidden from you. As a result, your conscious experience can mislead you into thinking that our circuitry is simpler than it really is. Most problems that you solve, that you experience as easy to solve, are very difficult to solve. They require very complicated neural circuitry. Principle number 4, different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems. And number 5, finally, our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. So, if you get if you find that there are just 3 or 4 marks, then you do not need to unpack these, but the way in which we have unpacked all these 5 principles, if there is a question carrying 10 marks, for instance, you will then have to describe these. For instance, you will have to talk about adaptive problems, the 4 main adaptive problems. Remember what these were? These are face recognition, then threat interpretation, language and navigation. These are things that one has to have, okay, and these are adaptive problems which have also remained with us. It is not that we have overgrown or outgrown them at all. Okay. Then you need to then say what consciousness is, how it is, it could be awareness, it could be a subjective experience or the wakefulness of the mind, and how you can give examples. For instance, we saw the example of how even a simple seemingly simple process like recognizing one's mother entails several very complicated steps, okay, processing by neural circuits, and we are in a way allowed, okay, we are allowed by the pressures of survival, we are allowed only the final high level conclusions, right. Why? the reason definitely is this, that with overloading of information, our goal of survival would not be fulfilled. There would be too much information overload if we were to be aware all the time of all those hundreds of processes that go into even the most simple, seemingly simple of conclusions, right. So, I hope this has been an interesting discussion for you, and you may go on to read evolutionary psychology, which is a relatively new domain, and there are other things that we are going to look at. For instance, we are going to next look at how the modern mind originated, right. We are talking about the legacy of the mind that a legacy of evolution and the mind that we possess. But then in the next lecture we are then going to find out how the mind that we have, the modern mind, originated in the first place. The modern mind is in many ways, of course, different from, there are many other things that we do, not just finding mates or finding food or raising children, right. There are other things that we do, other more complicated things, and this is what we shall be looking at in the next lecture. Thank you.